In the fortress of Rhuddlan in 1284, Edward I, contemplating a Gwynedd whose dynasty had been murdered, surviving heirs, young children forced into cages in Bristol to live the rest of their lives in little wooden boxes, or shipped to nunneries, or disemboweled, hung, drawn and quartered, and every symbol of its governance melted down or destroyed, whose countryside was now dominated by 14 alien-like lunar castles rising out of the horizon, forcing a people onto their back and sheltering little towns peopled by an organized colonization of English endowed with a sense of racial superiority. In that, King Edward issued the Statute of Rhuddlan, which an English historian has called the first colonial constitution. The land of Wales had been annexed out of existence and into England as a principality, recognized only in the sense that it was a private landholding of the king and soon his heir. This is Benjamin, and today we're talking about what happened after this and the colonization of a country, which laid the precedent for England's colonization of countries across the globe. It was trialed and tested here. Now, not everyone simply went along with this. Many Welsh, many thousands, can be forgiven and understood for not going along with this imposition of administrative law pressed down upon us. In the sharp legal discrimination which immediately came into force throughout Wales, we Welsh were classed as ben.llywelyn, mere Welshmen, across the apartheid wall with the enquiries, those who were privileged, who were not to be condemned in law by the oaths of Welshmen alone, who were to be tried by an English law and never in the Welsh language. From the beginning, Englishmen in Wales were excluded from being trialed by any Welsh, Holy Welsh jury and by any Welsh law. And these people were authorized to exclude every Welsh person from their towns as forensetsi, foreigners. To build these new boroughs and towns, 5,000 acres across the former realm of Gwynedd was upturned, taken from its proprietors and people, serfs and freemen alike. The people forced out. Llanfaes, which had at the eve of conquest been emerging into at last an urban centre upon which every state builds itself, was completely, its people were expelled, forced 12 miles to the east to Rhosfair, which was to add salt in the wound, renamed to Newborough, an English name for these people who had lost their home. At Llywelyn and Cwmtawy in the south, the new town was formed by taking over the former llys, the court, and the homesteads of free men. It was the same across the new lordships. Welsh free tenants were thrown out to make the borough of Holt. That's near Wrexham, and new little towns were being seeded, imported people filling them. We Welsh banned by law from entering these walls in our own country. In Dyffryn Clwyd, peoples there since time immemorial, forced out, ripped out, forced up to Hiraethog, the rain and cloud. The ancient land there of Tegengel, now renamed Flint. 600 good acres in Ystrad were evicted to make a park. The memories of these evictions rooted themselves in our folklore, as they had done earlier in the south with the Norman invasions of Morgannwg and Dyfed. Rhys ap Gruffydd of Afon in Morgannwg could remember how his people had been evicted 250 years earlier. And in the northeast, the Greys were hated people for what they did in 1284. Well over a century later, these evictions took place across all the fertile lands of Wales. One might ask, well, how on earth did the Welsh survive if this was going on? Because once you lose your urban centres and you're just basically a peasant farming people, you're never going to survive, really. I mean, unless you take an urban centre back, because urban economic administrative centres are required to survive in this world. I mean, it's just how it is. Unless you want to be like a tribe up in the jungle or mountains, and do we want that? No. And something happened to save us from that fate. Something horrific. And that was the Black Death. The plague. It hit the urban centres hardest, where all these new colonists were. They were trapped within these walls, plague ravaging through them. And so within a generation, they were dependent upon the people outside of the walls, and we began to rise up through the ranks. We did not emerge from this plague unscathed. Llanrwst was killed off that town, wild deer wandering through its square. ben.llywelyn the poet, it took him down with it. But the plague stopped the imperial administrative machine, grinding our country down. It threw it into confusion and uncertainty. It was not able to keep its exact, pinpointed Anglicization up. And we began to rebound in these urban areas. Even though that, there was still easily a 50-year period when we were completely outside these towns at sword point, unbroken. And that has shaped our psychology. You see it a lot in Welsh nationalist and folk music type attitudes today. It's bizarre for me, having grown up in a city, to experience it, but this hostility towards urban centres, finance, administrative areas, aspirational institutions located in urban environments. There's this romanticization of Mab Mynydd, the son of the mountain, as if we are forever rooted in a rural folk hinterland without being capable of being modern urban people. And that is what King Edward was trying to instill in our psychology. To hate urban power, to hate prestige, to hate all things that better ourselves and raise us up to aristocracy. He was trying to make us hate capital and industry and wealth. And we see that echoing in us today, and in Welsh nationalism especially, this hostility toward urban wealth. It's quite pronounced. And I would ask most people to think again. That mentality was what King Edward wanted you to have in order to oppress yourselves psychologically and be more, frankly, collectivist in this romanticized folklore mindset. And after they lost their land, they lost their law. But King Edward I did not expunge all of Welsh law completely, as is, you might find traditions of that belief. That's not exactly what happened. By and large, those offences which transgressed English felonies in English law were expelled from use. Galanos, the blood feud price, the blood price to pay, that gradually faded out. However, land law in Welsh, the cyfran, parceling out equal shares amongst heirs to a proprietor, an owner of land. This was definitely kept up for many centuries, and the English were eager to keep those elements of Welsh law alive. Because if you had two systems of law within our country, the English law and the Welsh cyfraith law, what it meant is those which followed the legal system in which wealth did not accumulate in a single heir, it made them over time poorer and instilled in them a psychological propensity to see themselves as inferior. After Edward I, Edward II, because two comes after one, he did give specific rights, and Welsh law did have a bit of a flourishing, and more administrators who were Welsh rose up through the ranks. In fact, many of the Welsh law textbooks which survive date from the 14th and 15th century. Learning in our own legal code was still going on despite this conquest, and in some cases because of it. But by and large, Welsh had become the law of an inferior breed, intentionally used to intensify our own psychological subjugation because of and by using the differences between English law as the prestige and the lower common folk law, which we, on the verge of that conquest in 1283, had almost begun changing our laws to reflect a finance economy at last, an urban economy at last. But we had not successfully yet gone through that change. And so our laws were fossilized at the moment just before we understood the value of property rights. And King Edward saw that. He saw that we were fossilized right at that moment, unable to move forward if he said, we'll use Welsh law for some things in order to exploit our own sense of inferiority growing out of it. One of these was the amobr, the price paid for a woman's sexual offense. Women were humiliated in the middle of courts, removing their tops to pay fines. Brother separated from sister, father disowned daughter, husband and wives at odds. Women increasingly pretending they were of English descent on one side to try and escape their own people's laws, because in English law, women did not suffer these humiliations. Their sex, their virginity was not owned in law, and this was used increasingly in the context of being seen as a barbarity, to be laughed at and humiliated. It became a joke for the townspeople to mock and humiliate the Welsh for adhering to these uncivilized customs. But why did we keep them? Because we weren't English. We aren't English. And there were some things within Welsh law that helped us escape the English authorities. Delays in procedure, the rotating of the breed, the lease, sharing out things between the cenedl, the nation. The processes which were legally allowed to be used enabled people to avoid certain types of tax in certain situations, but which kept them poor. And so the English, realizing a poor people could be easily controlled, allowed these to prevent us from having an economic, aspirational mind. And that meant we began to believe this fantasy that we are somehow more collectivist. Land law was the crux of this. English practice was much more efficient, clear, swift, and easy to use, and this was being generally counted as a superiority. Remember when Gwynedd fell, King Edward said at last the last ruler of that filthy British race had been cast down. This was a racially imposed law, apartheid in its clearest sense. And with these people unable to accumulate properties if they were adhering to Welsh law. The former Puir Walia, King Edward organised into what was essentially a single lordship of his own, a royal lordship, and he solidified this in 1301 by establishing the heir to the English throne as the Prince of Wales. An intentional mockery, but a brilliant, genius psychological weapon. This principality was now an extension, even a symbol of the English crown. The first years of colonialism were harsh and brutal. There were outbreaks of rebellion, like ben.llywelyn in 1294 and Rhys ap Meredydd in 1287. These were old-fashioned Welsh nobles who had actually, in some cases, resisted Llywelyn himself, like Ynir Vychan, who captured Madog. Yes, a Welshman captured the leader of a Welsh rebellion and personally delivered him to King Edward. Changing your coat is a very Welsh tradition. I need to note that Gwynedd Williams does not go into the revolt of Madog ap Llywelyn very much at all in 1294-1295, but he goes extensively into Llywelyn Bren, which I'll get to in a moment. I think Gwynedd Williams avoids going into the Madog ap Llywelyn revolt because of its deep and clear, obvious aristocratic and upper class sentiment based upon the privileges and rights of the aristocracy and claiming that Wales back. Whereas Llywelyn Bren, there is an aristocratic element because Llywelyn Bren does come from high lineage, but it is much more of a people's revolt, and this appealed at his collectivist and Marxist sympathies as a writer. Madog ap Llywelyn was the most serious revolt that would happen until Owain Glyndŵr, which swept most of Wales and pinned King Edward. I think it was Castell Conwy, I'll put it here if I'm wrong, almost threatening his life. But they were defeated in Powys. Once Madog was defeated, he spent the rest of his life imprisoned. Now, King Edward did this a lot to his Welsh enemies because he felt, I think, why execute them if he could put them in a little cage for the rest of their lives and release them if he found some kind of use for them to weaken his enemies. It's twisted. King Edward had to deal with his own lords, however. The family de Clare, ruling the south, east, built essentially an empire. They were quite cruel to the Welsh, mind. And King Edward had to go in and defeat them at Llandaff. And they had been in a localized Marcher Lord war with the Boynes, that word, who ran Brycheiniog. And he organised a parliament at Aveni to force down his authority upon these. Edward II relied heavily on his Welsh official class, which was very different to Edward I. This was centred especially around the north, in former Gwynedd. However, in the Southern March, matters were much more complex. In the Southern March, the Marcher Lords were much stronger because there had not been this fall of a kingdom in the same sense, and King Edward II had a bit of trouble with them, and the Marcher Lords of Declare had to be done away with. But one thing which was the climax of this crisis was Llywelyn Bryn. Llywelyn Bryn was the son of the last Lord of Senghenydd, the Lordship of Ifor Bach. He had become one of the Welsh official class despite this. There were books of Welsh law and French romance in his house. Llywelyn Bryn, Llywelyn of the Wood. His rebellion was ferocious in its intensity, even though very localized in the Welsh valleys. What's odd about this one is though his wife, Llegi, she appears to take a leading role in this revolt. This revolt is crushed, but Llywelyn flees to the Boyns, which I'd mentioned earlier, because they're a bit more favourable to the Welsh than the Clare areas were. And they try to give him some kind of pardon, but he is ruthlessly executed in Cardiff. And after this, it's much more direct imposition. The Welsh of the lowlands of Morgannwg there are forced out at sword point again, up into the valleys. There's mass clearance of lowland along the plain from lowlands of Gwent down all the way to Avon. We're forced out. It's a mass exodus of native Welsh from the coast up into the valleys. As Gwynedd Williams in his book points out, this is very localized, but it's a sign of things to come. King Edward I, the psychopath, interestingly favoured the church. He went to the Cistercian order in Ystrad Flir and he gave them benefaction. It's an astute political move because the Cistercians were very pro-Welsh and supported by the Welsh princes and the aristocracy around them before Conquest. And so he intentionally won their favour as a way of taking away the main proponent of diplomatic political propaganda that the Welsh of the time that we had. As a result, perhaps, the Welsh remained closed during this time to Welsh advancement of better positions and jobs. But we did begin to rise up in some clerical administrations. And because of this, I think, there's a flowering. We get writing in this early 1300s period, which is going to be very important for us. Two of the most extensive collections of religious, philosophical, and even romantic writings, Llyfr Gwyn Rhydderch and Llyfr Llenyddiaeth Brefi, come out of this church in the first half century of colonialism. So too do a host of manuals, prayers, and hymns, like the celebrated Emin Cirig Ferthyr. There were many works of piety, notably a Gysegrlan Fichedd, the Way of Holiness, and a Bible in Gymraeg, the Bible in Welsh. Actually, this Bible in Welsh was a synopsis, and I need to explain why, because at the time in Europe, you had people publishing literature in their own languages for the first time about this ecclesiastical context, but it was not the whole Bible. It was like when you get a book that summarizes up Stoic philosophy today and says, its basic points were this, this, and this. That's what was happening with religious texts in native languages, and we were partaking in this, and French Romanticism. Being part of a wider European context, despite our subjugation, we were still engaging in cultural learning and knowledge. And this would take us forward in the Protestant Reformation later on. The Welsh non-conformist tradition blooming out of this, using these works from the early 1300s to give us reason to state our faith beliefs against the established English Church 250 years later. More striking still, the Guild of the Poets and the Old Song of Taliesin. These were taken over by clerics in these ecclesiastical institutions, these monasteries, and we have collections of the princely poets being transcribed, kept alive recorded for future generations. Our inheritance is being saved. Those poetic guilds had gone unhinged from their patrons with the princes whom the poets served, and they now found clientele, essentially, in ben.llywelyn, the noblemen, the gentry, the aristocracy, and they began to pay poets who circled around Wales, singing praise, and they would pay them essentially for what was courtly propaganda. Critical at this point was the emergence of a poetic grammar, that of enquiries, written between 1322 and 1327. This poetic grammar is essential. It establishes the grammar of our court poetry, sets it down, talks about how to form poetry in a Welsh style. Praise remained core, as it did under the princes, carefully defined in a hierarchy from the values of God down to courtly maidens. And this gave a beautiful reference and a new outburst of verse. New kinds of poetry emerged in this time. The enquiries came, rhyming couplets alliterated with Conquest, internal rhyming. And in the decades coming, ben.llywelyn, surrounded by a circle of great talented poets, emerged, and this gave birth to a new blooming in Welsh language literature. And it's important as well to note that there was a clear shift toward English poetry and music right before this, and the poets responded by fighting back, changing, becoming more aggressive. They did what rap music did to rock and roll. They had new things. They were able to express humor. And if you can laugh at your enemy, that's a very good weapon. Satire emerges. It's wonderful. Love. Hundreds of poems about love and nature. The first and most common reaction to this colonial regime was what it was to be throughout history, a great movement of acceptance and accommodation to it. In Powys, families absorbed names like de la Pole. They became aristocrats in the English fashion, to change with the times. Llywelyn's aristocratic circle of administrators, after the fall of his land, they rushed to the side of King Edward to try and win a place in the new order of things. If you have an aristocratic position and great extensive lands and rank and status, why would you so easily give that up by risking falling down to the common people and the peasantry? Would you? I don't think I would. It doesn't mean you can't still help your country. These were the same people who paid these courtly poets, keeping the Welsh culture alive. It's just that in the common sense practicality of it, they had to work for the new regime in order to keep a place high enough to support their own culture well enough. These flares are bursting up all across Wales. There's a tension churning up through us from this oppression, this apartheid, this legal discrimination, this clash between urban and rural that's being wedged between us, forcing us to think in terms of hating towns, an aspect of colonialism where you force a people to have hostility towards the urban environment because it's the urban environment that always holds the power. And this tension would burst and snap like a bowstring 80 years later in medieval Europe's longest running national revolt. But for the time being, King Edward II was murdered in 1327, and this brief summertime, there was a brief moment when Welsh were allowed to rise up through the ranks within this colonial administration. That came to an end, and King Edward III came into power, and his son, the Black Prince, and more of the Black Plague, further deepening division between us and the town. This was a dark period, the middle of the 14th century. The rule of Edward III was an intensification of the exploitative nature of our relationship with England. When you look at a map today of Wales, and the roads look like tentacles extending into our country, seeping out the resources to fatten England, that shape has its roots in this time. That is what it comes from. With the coronation of Edward III, we get to a period where the colonial imposition is in a permanent crisis, and the economy and this continues bumping along, growing more and more tense without release until 1399, and the country is just burned to ruin in the National War of Independence to come. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much for watching. You've made it to the end of this video. Thank you. And if you like this content, help me keep this channel going. I have a Patreon page if you want to support that way. Or you could offer a super like or become a member of this channel. Either way, anyway, I'm just happy that you're watching, and we'll see you next time.